For coming. Tonight's topic is going to be on the Rosicrucian science of initiation. Some of you are new to me, and some of you I know from previous events. And what's different about tonight's event is we're really going to be focusing on trying to give a sense of the Rosicrucian system of initiation. There are many different spiritual systems in the world that have different types of initiation programs that a person goes through. And the Rosicrucian system is one that's been very influential in the West, but actually is sometimes hard to get information about what their actual system of development is. So we're going to try to present that tonight. You might have noticed that we have around in various locations some of the classical depictions of initiation processes coming from European alchemy and from the Rosicrucian tradition. And these often present in an allegorical form the different types of stages one goes through for spiritual development. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Robert Gilbert. I've been involved in Rosicrucian studies for about 25 years. When I got out of the Marine Corps in the mid-'80s, I began an intensive search of different spiritual traditions, and was particularly fascinated by European Rosicrucianism and the work of Rudolf Steiner. And having looked into many, many different Rosicrucian groups and teachers, it's my personal opinion that Rudolf Steiner's work is the most advanced Rosicrucian work ever to be made publicly available. There's, of course, always this hidden stream of Rosicrucianism that winds through Western European history. But for something that actually broke the surface and there was a public teaching of, it's really Rudolf Steiner's work that went into some of the deeper waters. So first thing we want to talk about tonight with this concept of the Rosicrucian science of initiation is what do we actually mean by initiation or an initiate? Because the terms are used very generally in modern metaphysical circles. But if you look at people that are being presented as initiates, they are often extremely different. One technical part of this is actually the structure of their consciousness, and the structure of their subtle bodies can be quite different from one to another, although they're being presented as initiates within different systems. So one of the discernment points that we have within the Rosicrucian system is that there are three different aspects of initiation or becoming an initiate. In one of these, what is actually being illuminated begins with the thinking process, with actually knowing about non-physical realities, knowing about the greater spiritual realities that we come from, and the spiritual depths of oneself. This is linked to the spiritual centers inside the head. And this is also linked to the illumination of the thinking process, so that with this process we actually know consciously the structure of the spiritual worlds, how we interact with them, how they influence us on a daily basis. And within this Rosicrucian system, that would technically be known as an initiate, someone that actually understands the systems. And that's one reason why you find in so much of the classical depictions all these presentations of different types of patterns, one pattern within another, often represented within sacred geometric forms. And within Western Europe, often sacred geometric forms that hold inside of them Hebrew letters that are a representation of certain states of consciousness, spiritual beings, things of that kind. This is because in this path of illumination, we find that everything is a thought form from the mind of God, and all those thought forms have a pattern to them. And the current term that we use for understanding those patterns is sacred geometry. So sacred geometry is a universal science for understanding the patterns of creation at every level, whether it's how the different spirituals are constructed, or different ranks of spiritual beings and their consciousness, or the different subtle bodies of a human being, whatever it claims, it has a pattern to it. And so no matter what tradition you study with, they will work with sacred geometry. Because the sacred geometry at the highest level is a pure, packed thought form from the mind of God that shows you the pure pattern of everything that's manifested from it. Now the next level is that of the clairvoyant. And from one perspective, we could say this is linked to the illumination of the heart and the feeling life. The Rosicrucians talk about a process within an initiation in which at a certain point, when the heart becomes open and unarmored, and we cultivate this feeling of unconditional love, there is an ignition of a kind of spiritual spark within the heart. And what happens then is that they describe it as an etheric rose light arises from the heart and moves up to what's commonly called the third eye center. And with that rose etheric stream, it enters into the centers in the head, that area that is technically at the third ventricle of the brain and was known as the cave of Brahma in the Indian teachings. This is a particular area that's open in the head that has a space between the pineal and pituitary glands. And as this space becomes illuminated, it leads to direct spiritual vision. This is then a clairvoyant. The clairvoyant can actually perceive non-physical realities. But depending upon the individual, they may not consciously understand the structures or discern the different things that they are actually seeing. And again, they might be different from some of the other stages that we'll talk about in a moment. So the third aspect here is that there's also the cultivation of action or of the will. And this is linked to the belly, or what in Japan they call the hara, or in Chinese alchemy they call the lower dantian, the lower will centers here. And through the action or willing form of illumination, one is able to take action esoterically. You're able to actually use non-physical realities to change things on the physical plane. Now, at the most extreme form of this, we have things like actual physical alchemy and the transmutation of one physical substance to another. But this is usually attained after going through multiple steps of being able to transform something that is less dense. And that is normally etheric energy fields. So the actual vibrational transformation of energy fields, energy healing, things of that kind, is something that you find very strongly on this path. So the person that can actually transform things using spiritual forces is referred to as the adept. Now again, this is kind of an ideal type of the different aspects of initiations or initiates. Often people have different parts of this in their own particular configuration and are stronger in one aspect or another. But that gives us a bit of an overview for how this fits together. Now, everything we're going to go over tonight is to give a straight, logical progression through some of the key knowledge of how the Rosicrucians understand and practice initiation. But all these things could be approached from other angles as well. So just to give you a sense of that, there's a reason why we're emphasizing the head, the heart, and the hara. When you study classical spiritual text, you find that they divide up the aspects of the human being into different types of forces. So the actual consciousness of the human being is often referred to as the astral body, and it's related to what's often called the spiritual plane of the astral plane. Within the Rosicrucian work, you find at a certain point that the consciousness body of the human being has three centers that can be worked on and awakened. And those three centers are around the head, the heart, and the hara. And this is really a universal teaching. If you study with the Buddhist, they'll talk about the thought, speech, and action. If you study with Sufis, they'll talk about the head, the heart, and the hands. All these different traditions are working with the same concept. If you studied Chinese medicine or Chinese internal alchemy like Qigong, you'll know that they have the upper, middle, and lower dantian. They refer to these as elixir fields, because when we understand what these actually are energetically, they are a kind of spiritual elixir field that we can work in and illuminate the forces of. So, depending on where we focus on primarily, we can first begin to develop the capacity of understanding things in a conscious manner, the patterns behind them, become the initiate, or directly perceive spiritual realities, the clairvoyant, or directly manipulate the spiritual forces, hopefully for a good outcome, and that's the adept. Now for tonight's talk, I'm going to ask if people would hold any questions till the very end, and we'll have a time for questions and answers. But I want to try to go through a particular logical thought path here to try to put a few pieces together. Now, the challenge of explaining some of the more obscure aspects of Rosicrucian spiritual initiation is that some of the practices really don't make a lot of sense until you understand the context that they're within. So we have to present a little bit of the Rosicrucian view of the context of all created life and for the evolution of the human being. Now, first thing I would say about the Rosicrucian tradition is that the Rosicrucian tradition is one of the most recent of the great traditions on the planet. If you go back to the Vedic tradition in India, Tibetan tradition, etc., many others, they're very ancient. But the Rosicrucian tradition really only broke the surface in human history in the 1600s. The first Rosicrucian documents appeared in the 1600s with texts like Fama Fraternitatis in 1604 in Germany. Now, when these Rosicrucian texts first became available, one of the things that they emphasized in these texts was that the Rosicrucian organization wasn't connected to any one authoritative teacher, and it wasn't connected to any particular type of control structure. There was no institution for it. It was really a very free and independent path of modern initiation. And so one thing we're going to see tonight as we go through the presentation is that this fits within their understanding of the evolution of human consciousness, that we have attained a state today where there is actually a transition from an external human guru-based system to one in which the awakening of the human I am presence becomes the guru and connects directly to spiritual forces without a human intermediary. That was a fundamental concept in the early Rosicrucian text. So the Rosicrucian order really became something that never had an external expression until later. In times people would found different types of Rosicrucian lodges. Many of them were quite remarkable in their time. In Germany and elsewhere, there are various types of Rosicrucian organizations in the US today. But what I want to emphasize is that what we're presenting tonight are concepts related to the original European Rosicrucian impulse. It's not related to any particular central teacher, organization. We're not trying to recruit you for anything. This is really a path of direct connection to spirit by understanding spiritual processes. So it all begins, understanding the whole set of processes, by understanding where everything comes from. In the ancient Greek times, they talked about the source of all being with the name of the One, in capital letters, the One. And this is a beautiful representation within sacred geometry that everything comes from a unified source. So within human evolution, we've gone through a certain pathway that we'll talk about in a moment, where in sacred geometry and the ancient Egyptian mysteries, they talked about the one becomes the two becomes the four becomes the eight. It ends up becoming the 10,000 things the Chinese talk about. But everything comes from the unified source of the One. It's all creation from the mind of God. And in the classical Western work from Greece and elsewhere, they talk about thoughts in the mind of God being the source of everything. And that's what Plato referred to as ideal types, or ideal thought forms. These are actually what construct the world. These thoughts in the mind of God take on different separate qualities and different separate functions in the world, and then they manifest through the different planes. It's understood from the classical Western Hermetic as above, so below tradition, of which Rosicrucianism is one of the most recent expressions, that the nature of the mind of God is essentially pure consciousness. Everything is based on a field of pure consciousness. You find the exact same teaching in the ancient Vedic text and many other world traditions. Consciousness is the basis. So starting from these differentiated thought forms in the mind of God at a very high level, those thought forms have within them specific patterns. The pattern of what will later become something that crystallizes into the physical world, or the nature of a spiritual being, or a spiritual process of some type. And again, that's what we refer to as sacred geometry. So to actually begin to access these packed thought forms, these very dense spiritual sources of everything in creation, again, every major tradition will teach it in terms of pure patterns, in terms of pure sacred geometry. So from that thought form pattern, sacred geometry level, it then moves down through the levels of manifestation to create everything in our world. And the first thing that it creates are the manifested beings. Now, the manifested conscious spiritual beings that surround us in invisible space all the time, and that make up the world at a much higher level, in the Western tradition, we primarily know through terms like the angelic ranks or the spiritual hierarchies. In the classical Western tradition, there was understood to be 9 different ranks of angelic beings. So we often, in general metaphysical circles or in external churches today, hear about a few of them. We hear about the angels and the archangels, occasionally in archai. The Elohim is sometimes talked about, but not often clearly in its original form as the Elohim being one of the different spiritual ranks or hierarchies. Because the term Elohim in the original Hebrew has a suffix im, Elohim. And im in Hebrew is actually a plural suffix. It means the Elohim are a group of spiritual beings. When we have the translation from Hebrew into English of the book of Genesis, back in 1980 I lived in Israel and studied Hebrew at a kibbutz. One of the things that was discussed is that when you get these translations from the text, the term Elohim is translated in English as God. and it seems to refer to the unitary Godhead. But the original term Elohim refers to a plurality of beings that are not the unified Godhead, but in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth, is the beginning of Genesis. And so what that shows is there's a rank of spiritual beings that were directly indicated that did the creation process. And so from the Elohim, you then have other hierarchies we hear very little about, because their state of consciousness is very elevated, but they're known in the classical text. And these are the Dynamis, Kyriatetes, Throne, Cherubim, and Seraphim, 9 different ranks. And it's understood that these beings were created in a particular type of cyclical process in space and time that in sacred geometry is represented as a spiral form. So if you look at the form of a spiral, you have the completion of a circle, but as the circle is moving, it's moving either up or down. And so as the spiral is moving, it's completing a circle here, but now it's at one higher octave, and another end of the cycle on a higher octave. And so this becomes the ladder, the Jacob's ladder, the ladder of lights, the ladder of the angelic beings, spoken of in the classical text. The significance of this for us is that these different beings are of different levels of maturity, have different levels of the expansion of their consciousness, and different possibilities for action. So what is sometimes treated in very intellectual, abstract ways in dealing with angelic hierarchies was understood in the initiation circles as beings one directly interacts with all the time. They invisibly guide and affect our consciousness and life every minute of every day, but we don't perceive it, just as we don't normally have organs to perceive non-physical realities until they're developed. So again, what the significance of this is that as the Godhead has created the world, the thought forms at a very high level are given a part of the consciousness of the Godhead that in classical texts is sometimes described as an ocean of fire. So if we think of the pure consciousness of the Godhead as an ocean of fire, then there is one flame, one spark detached from that ocean of consciousness and given to the conscious spiritual beings that make up what in the West we refer to as the angelic ranks or the spiritual hierarchies. Now this is very important because it's that spark from the Godhead that is essential to understand the Rosicrucian path of initiation, because it's about igniting that spark inside the human being. Every human being has that divine core, what in the Western system is often referred to as the I am core of self-awareness, straight from the Godhead. The thing is to uncover it and to fan the flame into full activity. So as the thoughts from the mind of God move down and we have the manifested beings, in classical texts they describe the spiritual hierarchies, they describe the angelic beings in very specific ways. Their names actually mean particular things. So if you look at the names of the archangels, Raphael means God heals. And other names like Michael mean such things as various powers within God that in the Rosicrucian tradition are expressed as such thing as Michael being the direct expression of the cosmic intelligence, that the fullness of understanding that the Godhead has is actually expressed through the being of Archangel Michael. So different beings, their names actually mean something. Different teachers in esoteric circles will sometimes break this down, even according to their old Egyptian languaging. So for something like Urael, it would be broken down into the U-Ra-El, meaning literally the sun vibration god. They're all different qualities of the Godhead, and that's why in the classical text the angels are sometimes referred to as God's messengers. And it was understood that we had to actually be clear about what beings were interacting with us, because if we just say, oh, I spoke to God or God told me this, it's too amorphous. We don't know what beings are actually speaking to us. And not all the beings are beneficial. Again, something that comes from the classical text. We'll get to that in a moment. But as we then have the manifestation from the mind of God through the angelic ranks, we then come to the point that we then have the different manifested spiritual levels. So these different consciousness levels also will then manifest as what we think of as spiritual planes. In the East, they have all kinds of different names for the different planes of existence. And in the West, we have the terms you may have heard before with the physical plane, the etheric world, the astral plane, the causal plane, etc. And there are different ways this is divided in different systems. But essentially, these different planes of existence are actually part of the body of God, but they're the body of God at a particular level of function or activity. The astral plane, for example, is really the manifested body of God at a consciousness level of a particular frequency. And so the manifestation of the spiritual levels and other beings, forces, and then the structures that manifest from the original pattern, which is spiritual, into the structures in the physical world. So things that we're taught in sacred geometry about pure archetypal structure, like what the Greeks taught with the Platonic solids, the octahedron, dodecahedron, etc., they actually manifest as physical structures in things like the mineral realm. And you can see the stones that have that structure. But the key thing for the Rosicrucians is that these patterns, everything in the world comes directly from the One, from the mind of God. And then to be able to actually discern the different qualities and functions of things in the manifest world, including things like the different spiritual beings that everyone is connected to all the time, and to become conscious of those and how they affect us, there would be teachings hidden within geometric glyphs. Because again, the geometric glyph holds pure pattern information. It's a packed thought form from the mind of God of a pure pattern. So the tree of life holds a tremendous amount of embedded information. In some of our previous talks and workshops, some of you have been with us when we described the way that there are 22 paths connecting the 10 spheres on the tree of life. And those in the classical Kabbalah are described as being related to a pattern of 3, 7, and 12. We're not getting into that part of it tonight. It's tangential to what we're discussing. But just to hook it up for those of you that have been with us before, that's an aspect that's within the tree of life that actually shows us the coding pattern of anchors for energy in the human body, for the human consciousness within 3 points of the astral body, for the human life body within 7 points, and then for the human physical body within 12 locations. Just as in Chinese medicine, it's described there are 12 primary meridians. So these numbers are related to functions and the pattern from the mind of God. A huge amount is embedded in these, and different teachers can focus on completely different things from the same pattern, because it's holographic. It's like a jewel, and different facets have all these different things. So if we take a look at what we're looking at tonight, there's another pattern that's laid within the tree of life, which is that it has 3 different pillars inside of it. Now the 3 pillars have an interesting quality to them. On the left and the right hand pillars, which are sometimes referred to in the West as the pillars of mercy and severity, they don't go all the way up or all the way down. The only one that goes all the way up and all the way down is the central, or the middle pillar. And this is related to a very deep teaching of how to discern 3 different types of spiritual forces, or actually 3 different types of spiritual beings in the classical tradition. Now, unfortunately, this idea of discerning 3 different types of spiritual beings was primarily lost over time, so that in most external Western churches today, it's not taught anymore, unfortunately, because it was in the original tradition. And instead, things are presented only as like, there's the good spiritual beings and the bad spiritual beings. Well, the problem is, as we are created from the Godhead, the first movement from the one is into the two. It's like the first split of the egg in the mother's womb to be the 2 different parts that will then split to become the full manifest human being. So that split into 2 is actually taking the unified aspect of the Godhead, the one, and moving into 2 opposite polarities. In the Indian tradition, they talk about this being Shiva and Shakti, these archetypal yin and yang, masculine and feminine aspects. Now this is absolutely critical, because you can't say that one is good and one is bad. You can't have a purely polarized system and say that's good, that's bad. If we have male and female, which one's good and which one's bad? But this type of thinking infects everything in the Western world today, like our politics. Well, if this side is right, that side must be wrong, sort of thing. Everything is brought into this polarized dichotomy. But the original understanding was much different. If we study classical teachings like in Tibetan Buddhism, they talk about, the path of development is not to one extreme or another. It's the middle way. It's that central path, holding a balance between 2 different extremes. And so the same thing is true on the tree of life. We have a middle path, just like the Tibetans talk about, and then things can go off balance to one extreme or another. Do you want to be too hot or too cold? You don't want either, you want to be in the middle. But this applies to everything within spiritual development. So again, we could talk a lot about this, but I want to give you the direct application of it now as a building block toward the overall concept of Rosicrucian initiation. So one of the things that needs to be discerned with this concept of the Godhead creating the world and the different levels of manifest being that are referred to in the classical text is that there are beings that connect to the middle pillar. They go all the way up and all the way down. That means they connect to the highest levels of the Godhead, and they also connect all the way down to the level of the manifest creation. In the Western tradition, within esoteric Christianity, this is connected to the Christ or Christic beings, or within the monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they refer to them as Michaelic beings, because Michael is considered to be the highest of the archangels. And so one of the names that is attributed to the term Michael is that the name Mikael means who is as God. And so that idea that Michael holds the quality of the Godhead, but reduced in scale to where it can be interacted with at an archangelic level. The meaning of this is that when we hold to the middle way, perfect balance in all polarities in life, then we're on the path that takes us all the way. But through free will, through the mysteries that are described in the book of Genesis and in the Kabbalah and many other traditions, where through the exercise of free will, we can choose to go off to one direction or the other and get off balance. The same thing is true for certain types of higher spiritual beings who actually have the spiritual task of being somewhat polarized and pulling us one direction or another. Now, the way that this got confused for the modern Western tradition is that some of the terms used in ancient times got to be confused together so they could no longer differentiate their meaning, which leads to a lot of confusion. So toward one hand, toward the left-hand pillar, you have spiritual beings that don't understand or really care for the physical world. They're not into that. The physical world is something that seems like a place of suffering. And many of the ancient traditions of the world were heavily influenced by these beings, with teachings of the physical world being an illusion, of the physical world being a place of suffering, get off the cycle of karma and reincarnation, etc. In the Western world, it was understood that these spiritual beings are advanced spiritual beings, more advanced than human beings. And they also have tremendous spiritual light. When one encounters them, one does not encounter a being of darkness. One encounters a being of tremendous light. And so the name given to the leader of this particular spiritual group was Lucifer, and these are Luciferic beings. Now, in most traditions today, this is completely confused because the term Lucifer is completely mixed up with the term Ha-Satan, or Satan, which is a dark being. And so all differentiation is lost. But the Luciferic beings were understood as beings of great spiritual light, but who do not completely understand physical reality or the process of human evolution in the physical world. To them, it seems like we're children being tortured in a place we don't need to be, so get off the cycle and go back to spirit. Again, this is a very deep topic talking about the consciousness and activities of these beings, and it's made doubly difficult because there's so much baggage attached to the names today that are not part of the original tradition. But that basic idea here is that to one side, you can go, even with any human being, toward a type of spiritual development where you really focus on spirit, but your physical life goes straight to hell. You know, you're not able to pay the bills, and your relationships with people suffer, and you're not taking care of business, and your life's not going that well, but you're really focused on spirit all the time, but not grounded. Now that can also lead, unfortunately, to forms of spirituality that are illusory or hallucinogenic, so that the things that are being perceived and worked with are not really real, or they're distorted through our lens in a particular way that's really not helpful. And so this is connected to what classically is referred to as the Luciferic extreme. Now, on the other hand, as you might imagine, it's the exact opposite polarity. If one is connecting to spirit, but not really following the full process of creation in matter and connecting to that, then the other is going to be deeply connected to matter. It's going to be deeply connected to the process of linking onto the physical materialization process and loving physicality. The first identification of these beings in ancient text was really in the old Persian Zoroastrian tradition. And in the Persian Zoroastrian tradition, they referred to these beings as Angramenu or Ahriman. Could you let the person in the door? Now, this being of Ahriman or Angramenu in the old Persian Zoroastrian text was contrasted to a being that was related to the being of the sun. The name was given as Ahura Mazda. And for the old Persian Zoroastrians, they said that this is the spiritual being that you can spiritually perceive clairvoyantly in the aura of the sun. And this is the same concept we have of the sun god that then later becomes the manifested concept of the solar logos in the later Western tradition. The spiritual being directly related to the sun. So it's opposed by this dark being of materiality. So human beings can fall into this as well by becoming completely materialistic, so that we don't even believe that spirit exists. Spirit is some type of illusion that we have. There's nothing but random evolution over time through completely physical, biological processes. And there is no spirit, there's nothing of that kind. So this becomes a kind of modern materialistic scientific perspective that's very sharp in some ways, but has absolutely no spiritual perception. And so for complete materialists, they fall completely into this pillar. And so we can see that type of dichotomy that's being created here and holding the balance between it, between spirituality and life in the world. Now the Ahrimanic aspect then took on other names and other times. The Gnostics referred to the being of Ahriman, or the beings of the same quality, referred to as Ahrimanic beings, as the demiurge. So you read all these Gnostic texts about the demiurge, the dark lord of this earth that created the physical world. It has many different manifestations in the Gnostic text, and you can find variants on that in other traditions as well, like in South America. Then in Egypt, this polarity was referred to as Set, and Set was shown contrasted with Horus. And actually there would be an empowerment of the pharaoh by both Horus and Set when the pharaoh would take the throne. That term Set, when the Hebrew people left Egypt, led by Moses, who had been initiated in the Egyptian temples, that term Set became Ha-Satan, and so Set became Satan. Now Ha-Satan is a Hebrew term meaning the adversary, and so it means that this is a being that has an adversarial relationship to the human being. And so that's where we then got the concept in the West of Satan. Again, this is a dark type of being, very different from the Luciferic beings as beings of light. And so this has to be understood as a basis, number one, to study different esoteric traditions. Because, for example, if you study Theosophy, like the work of Madame Blavatsky, the Luciferic beings are actually the redeemers. Luciferic beings are actually our guides. Then in other texts, like the Rosicrucians, they say, no, the Luciferic beings have some spiritual wisdom, but we have to stay on that middle path. There's a different set of beings here. Now this idea of holding the balance between these two types of beings is something that plays out in everyday life. And it's a constant dynamic process for every human being. If we were to strip away the veil, we would see that these invisible Luciferic and Ahrimanic beings are influencing our consciousness at all times to go to one direction or the other, just as the beneficial beings are also connecting with us. And in the ancient temple science, it was understood that our connection to these beings was purely through resonance. When we think in a particular manner, when we feel in a particular manner, all of our thoughts, all of our feelings, all of our internal states have an energetic quality to them, and they will resonate like an antenna with qualities of the exact same type in the other worlds. So if we have a very negative materialistic thought, that will resonate us with the more Ahrimanic beings. If we get a type of emotional striving to have only ecstatic process in our life and is completely spiritual without ever having to do the dishes or wash the car, then that will connect us more to the Luciferic types of beings. And then, of course, things that are more of a grounded nature to the central pillar. Now, one illustration I'd like to give of this, of how this same teaching appears in multiple places, is that in the teachings of esoteric Christianity, they have a really remarkable depiction of it. And that is, if you look at any pictures of the crucifixion of Christ from medieval times, they show Christ crucified between two thieves. So there's actually three crosses, and Christ is in the center. And the three crosses are actually three pillars. And there's three different beings on three pillars, with the Christ on the center. And then toward one side, on the pillar toward one side, is a thief that is shown on the paintings as inclining his head toward the Christ. And that's actually connected to the Luciferic beings. And that's demonstrated with that thief basically saying to the second thief that you and I deserve our fate, but this man is blameless. And he asks Christ to take him with him into his Father's kingdom. Christ replies, you will be with me in my Father's kingdom tonight. Because the Luciferic beings are not really opposed to the Christic forces and things in the way that the Ha-Satanic beings, the Ahrimanic beings are. So when you see these medieval depictions, Christ is on the center, one thief is there with his head inclined toward the Christ, and the other thief has his head turned away. And that's the one that is referred to in the Gospel of John as rebuking and reviling the Christ. And because the whole spiritual quality is different here. And that's again a direct depiction of three different types of spiritual beings that one interacts with. Now, the problem that can come with this is that when it's stripped away from the original initiation, very straightforward context, then people can get very worked up about hindering beings and have very sensationalistic reactions to them. But it's something like if you were to be told that you have 10 billion germs on your skin right now, and you do, you have billions of germs on your skin right now, but if your biological landscape is healthy, it doesn't matter. You're going to be fine. So if you don't get all freaked out about it, it's just the way things are already working before you even knew about it. We're influenced by these types of beings all the time. We are like fish that live in an ocean that don't know there's any water. These beings are surrounding us all the time, and our boundaries are actually not solid. They move through us, our consciousness, our feeling life, all the time. So that's one of the first things that would be clarified on the Rosicrucian path, is understanding these different types of influences that we come into contact with all the time. Let me hold questions to the end, if I could, please. So the next thing we want to look at is the structure of the human being. And so the human being can be nothing other than a microcosm of the macrocosm. We hear that a lot in a really abstract way. But what it really means is that the human being has to be constructed out of the manifest levels of the Godhead spread throughout the universe that take on all these different planes that we hear about. So, for instance, there are different levels of a human being. In the esoteric tradition, we'll talk about a human physical body. That's related to the earth itself. It's what in India, in Sanskrit, they refer to as the sheath made of food. That's the literal name in Sanskrit for the physical body, the sheath made of food, because we take in physical substance, we put it into a field of force that is the outline of our body, and then it fills it out with physical substance. So the physical body is of the same nature as the earth. We draw the substance from the earth, we give it back at death. Then we have the level of life energy that's called chi, ki, prana in the east, or the etheric in the west, from the Greek term for life energy. They have other names in the Hebrew Kabbalah related to concepts like ruach, etc. But basically it's pure life force. This is like the life energy of the Godhead moving through the world. We take a small detachment of that life energy and individualize it to become our life body during our incarnation. It's related to the element of water in physical elements. In the Egyptian mysteries, they have these beautiful depictions of a particular spiritual being that has a function that is represented by how it's shown as being a ram-headed god. All of these animal-headed gods in Egypt, the animal is related to the function of the being. And so this ram-headed god called Khnum in the Egyptian mysteries is working with a potter's wheel, and he's sculpting these energetic bodies for human beings that are about to incarnate. And so it's part of this concept. What we would call chi, ki, prana, the etheric, was related to the body of the Ka in ancient Egypt. Then we have our consciousness body, which includes both our emotional and mental function. Sometimes this is referred to generally as the astral, or sometimes it's broken down to being the emotional and mental body, which can also be referred to as the lower and upper astral. But there are all just various ways to break it apart. But essentially it's the consciousness field of God that we bring into ourselves as an individualized astral body. And that emotion and mind aspect is related to the element of air as another crystallization of the same force, but now into concrete physical matter outside of us. And then our self-awareness, our I am presence, is related to fire. This is what the Rosicrucians refer to as the ego with a capital E. But it's important to understand that when they say that, they don't mean the ego of psychology. It's not your little ego. This is your I am presence. This is your divine spark of being self-aware. So that's the whole thing through the Jewish Kabbalistic mysteries of the burning bush, I am, the 7 I am sayings of the Christ in the Gospel of John, etc. It's all about that development of pure self-awareness. Why would it be linked to fire? Because that's the pure spark of the fire, the flame from the ocean of fire of the Godhead that we have inside of us. And so to understand this type of basic structure of the human being, that every part of ourselves is a detachment from part of the levels of God that make the levels of the world outside of us, that we individualize to become a self-aware separate being. So that's an absolutely fundamental part of understanding what being a microcosm of the macrocosm is. So then when we go through a process of initiation, initiation is really a process of becoming aware of who am I, why am I here, where do I come from, And how do I develop a process by which I can become more self-aware and accelerate my process of development? Now, there's a very important thing that comes in Rosicrucianism that I like a lot at this point, which is that along the path of initiation, as you begin to understand processes other people don't understand, there can be the temptation to use that knowledge to manipulate other people, or to manipulate all types of things. Let's say you understand psychology and somebody else doesn't. You can manipulate them with all types of things in neurolinguistic programming and things of that kind. What words do you use? What tonality do you use? How do you present the information? You can manipulate them all over the place. And so in Rosicrucianism, there's a very strong rule that all the powers and understandings gained on the path will be put to the service of other people. And so that's like the first rule in Rosicrucianism. Otherwise, as you develop the abilities, you will get that temptation of, well, I could get what I want right now because they don't understand this process, but I do. So initiation and inner alchemy. Alchemy has to do with the transformation of something from a base state to a higher state. But there's an important thing that's hidden in that, which is that the base state has to exist first. You're turning lead into gold, but there had to be the lead there first to create the gold. So this means that hidden within, all types of lower structures are the seed of its full fruition, very much like the classical illustration of the caterpillar and the butterfly. You know, you don't know looking at the caterpillar that over time its entire structure has laid within it the ability to become a winged butterfly. But it's the exact same thing in the human being, which is why they depicted the higher spiritual bodies of the human being as always being with wings, traveling through the spiritual worlds. So we develop the physical body. We develop the body of life force. We develop our consciousness. And in the Rosicrucian work, there's very detailed descriptions of earlier stages of evolution. And it relates to things like Eastern teachings about the great Manvantaras, stages of planetary evolution, in which all these things were laid down at an earlier time that we're not going to get into tonight. So make it very straightforward. But then we come to the point of developing our self-awareness, the I am presence. And that's where we are today. Human beings have developed this, and now we're at this critical point of developing the I am self-awareness, which the Rosicrucians see as being the true message of Christianity. The Rosicrucians see the whole issue of Jesus and Christ being a particular human being of Yeshua ben Joseph, a rabbi who had developed to the point of being able to actually unify himself energetically and in consciousness with the being of the Christ. Now, who is the Christ? It's related to what I referred to before in the Zoroastrian tradition with the Hura Mazdal, the aura of the sun, and the classical tradition of the sun god. Because it was understood in the ancient traditions this was not something pagan, in the detrimental way we use that term sometimes today in the West, but rather this had to do with the whole way that God manifests in the world. And so if we look at our local system, the solar system, everything moves around the sun. And the sun is the inexhaustible source of life in the solar system. It is light and it is heat. Without that light and heat, we would have no life here. And it was understood that if you actually literally look into the energetic aura of the sun, there are spiritual beings of such a high nature that it would be very difficult for them to manifest into denser bodies. They need something of that level to match their own nature. And this is connected to certain of the spiritual hierarchies and to the Christ being. So when they tried to understand this whole mystery of what is the Christ in early Christian centuries, there was a wonderful text written by one of the great early church fathers in Egypt, whose name was Origen. And Origen wrote a book called On First Principles. And in the book On First Principles, he gives a very simple and beautiful description of how can we understand what the Christ being is. The Christ being is nothing other than a being emanated from the Godhead that has all the qualities of the Godhead in a unified form, but reduced in scale to where human beings can directly interact with this being. Because it was understood originally that the Godhead is everything. The Godhead is literally everything everywhere. But you take those qualities and you create a being that has that at the macrocosmic level, and that was understood to be the Christ being. And then the human being was actually the microcosm of that emanated Godhead. We are the crown of creation, etc. And so what this means in the early Christian centuries is they understood the Christ as being of the exact same nature as the human being. The Christ is almost a kind of oversoul of all human beings at the macrocosmic level. We all connect to the Christ being. And one of the things that Rosicrucians lament is that this impulse came in from lower states of consciousness trying to understand the teachings in Christianity that then somehow made Christianity something that was a separate sect, separate from other sects, which was not the initial concept. The initial concept is that the Christ being is the actual higher consciousness aspect that is a living being at a higher macrocosmic level that every human being is connected to. It's not something for one particular set-aside group of people. Some might be more conscious of it than others, but from the perspective of a Rosicrucian, you can find people that are more deeply connected to Christ than someone that says they're Christian, who are Buddhist, Hindus, whatever. It has to do with their illumination of consciousness and what they're resonant with. And so it's a thing of this actual manifestation of the Godhead at a higher level that has all the qualities of the Godhead so we can interact with it, reduced in scale. So this I am self-awareness is something that is related to the entire Christ mystery, building through the Jewish text and then into the esoteric Christian text. So again, the 7 I am sayings of the book of John are understood by the Rosicrucians not to be that you have to pledge some type of loyalty to Jesus Christ as a kind of master in order to not be tortured or to die forever, but rather it's a matter of the I am is the way and the light. The I am is the resurrection and the life. That it's that spark of the divine inside of us that's of the exact same nature as the Christ being. There is no separation between them. They're both emanation from the same ocean of fire. That's the consciousness of God. That's the essence of all of this. And that's the stage we're at today. So the Rosicrucians see this as the point we're at where we have to illuminate our awareness, to actually illuminate that spark. Now, we've gone through a process we'll talk about in a moment where actually we have become more and more individualized. And when we actually pass through this stage at a higher level, we first become more deeply self-aware, but then we actually become aware in a transpersonal way. So not all of ourselves is so focused. But first it starts with focus on the self. We'll get to that in a moment. Now the inner alchemy of this is that once we have developed that fire, and this is represented in the esoteric Christian tradition as the flame above the head of the disciples at Pentecost. It's a literal flame that ignites a spiritual structure that moves in a vertical axis through the human body. And at this energy center above the human head, it illuminates to be the center of the Holy Spirit within Christian depictions. But I've worked with people from many other religions that know all about this first center above the head and its ignition into higher consciousness. This is a particular way it can be presented in the Western understanding. So as we develop that aspect of ourselves that's of the same nature as the Christ, same nature as the Godhead, can now illuminate with light and transform with the fire the lower bodies. That means that then we can train our I am spiritual self-awareness to actually transform our consciousness to a higher level. It's an alchemical transformation of the consciousness to become something different of a higher nature. And then it can then transform our entire body of life force, the entire etheric body, chi, ki, prana, to a higher level. And then it can actually transform the physical body. That's what in esoteric Christianity is referred to as the resurrection body of the Christ after the crucifixion. And sometimes in the esoteric text is referred to as the phantom body. In modern metaphysical terms, we primarily refer to it as the full light body. So again, what we have is the I am, once it completely develops, and we have that awakened spark of the divine inside of us, it transforms our consciousness. Now, as it transforms our consciousness, we have to start with, and now we're getting onto the road of what is Rosicrucian initiation about, and why is it done this way, to first start to analyze our own internal life. We have to be aware of what am I thinking, what am I feeling, what am I doing? Because most of the time we're completely unconscious. These are the kind of things that you find in many traditions, like in the work of Gurdjieff. If you look at the foundations of Gurdjieff's work, he talks about the fact that the terror of the situation, in his terms, is that the whole human race is asleep. We think we're awake and we're walking around in the world, but we're still fast asleep, and we just keep playing out the same reactive psychological patterns again and again and again. So we have to go through a process that he calls waking up and becoming self-aware. And so we start simply observing ourselves. So the process of self-observation is fundamental in just about all classical initiation traditions. Without self-observation, you can't begin to crystallize out this level of awareness. And you can't start changing your detrimental psychological patterns of how you think and how you speak and how you interact with people and how you feel internally to something that's more beneficial. Now, over time, this develops to a higher level, to where your awareness actually becomes transpersonal, so that you're not completely focused on yourself, but rather you can take in the consciousness states of more and more people. And we'll get back to that a little bit later. This also develops into being able to think in a way that goes beyond simple mechanical thinking in our mind. It's what the Rosicrucians call sense-free thinking. It means that we can think in terms of pure archetypes. Our mind can now access the pure archetypes from the mind of God. And that's what sacred geometry was understood to be by the Greeks. So what to us seems like a very abstract philosophy. What are they talking about? They're meditating on ideal types and all these geometric forms. What are the Greeks doing with that? Why are they wasting their time with it? They understood that what they were actually meditating on was sense-free thinking, being able to actually go into resonance with the actual forms from the mind of God that hold the patterns of everything in the world. It's a communion with the mind of God. And so true sacred geometry was always on that level. And this can also give rise to something called the new clairvoyance that we'll talk about in a moment, because the whole path of clairvoyance has changed over time. Because our state of consciousness used to be different, our way that we could perceive things spiritually was also different. As our consciousness changes, how we can perceive things spiritually transforms over time. And again, the I Am can transform our life force, and it transforms our life body into what is sometimes referred to as the immortal body. It has different names in different traditions. And then transforms the physical. So the whole process of internal alchemy at its highest level is related to this. And so to understand it within its full context, there's the understanding of the evolution of consciousness. One of the Rosicrucian practices that we'll talk about at the end of the talk, as far as practical exercises, is that they examine things in the living world to see the stages that it moves through. Because they understand that within a seed is the complete pattern matrix for everything that seed will ever do once it begins to grow and sprout and blossom and fruit and wither and decay and disappear. All those stages are hidden within the seed. And so all things go through this process. So when we observe the growth of a child, we see all of these stages, one after another, in a lawful process. The life of every human being, from an infant to old age, is a microcosmic fractal of what we go through over great periods of time in spiritual development. It follows a particular trajectory. So to clarify some of this, and this is a very general gloss on it, we descend originally from spirit to earth. And with human development, we went through a particular process that in the Indian tradition is referred to as Kali Yuga. This Kali Yuga spiritual tradition was understood as being the spiritual dark age. And depending on which of the Indian teachers you talk to, some say that we're still in Kali Yuga and will be for a long time to come. Others, such as in the Sri Yuktasvara Babaji lineage, say that it's actually already ended. And actually, the timing of the Kali Yuga Dark Age for human evolution is exactly the same for the ending point between the European Rosicrucians and the Babaji Sri Yuktasvara lineage, which is a very interesting link. So in this Kali Yuga Dark Age, we had a particular situation take place. In the early times, human beings were not self-aware. You study ancient texts, they're always identifying themselves with the tribe, the group. I am so-and-so, the Philistine, the Samarite, whatever it might be. They always identify with the group. In ancient Greece, to be exiled from your city was like a fate worse than death. Today, it's like, you're not going to put me in jail, I just get to leave the city? Great, I'm gone. But for them, to be separated from the group was terrible. It was a punishment because they had a group consciousness. So they weren't self-aware, but what they did have in early times was a lot of clairvoyance. And so you still see this with some of the traditional peoples on the earth today. Those traditional peoples preserve this type of native clairvoyance that can be quite strong. And the Rosicrucians see as actually it's being related to the blood in a particular way. So what happens over time is that as we become more self-aware, we're not fully self-aware, but we're moving toward it. We're becoming more individual in our self-awareness. This leads to what the great teachers in ancient India referred to as the Kali Yuga Dark Age, because literally the clairvoyance is going dark. The people in India are losing their clairvoyant faculties, and we can no longer directly see spirit. And so there's a kind of a panic that you can see in some of these old texts that leads to the teaching of well, the physical world's an illusion. You're about to get stranded here. This is actually a place of suffering. So get off the cycle of karma and reincarnation, off the suffering, and just go back to the spiritual world, to nirvana permanently. But it was not understood the complete sequence of this, at least the way the Rosicrucians see it. So human beings began to more and more lose the ability to clairvoyantly perceive the world around them, but they developed the ability to think in a logical, linear way and to think of themselves as more of a separate individual being. This develops over time until we reach a kind of a low point of this that is the nadir point that the Rosicrucians see as what happened around the time of the incarnation of the Christ being within Jesus of Nazareth. That is a human being attaining the state that creates the template for the rest of humanity to actually unite with the Christ being and develop that state of awareness. And so there's actually two different movements happening here simultaneously. There's an ascending movement and a descending movement. Our capacity for developing higher consciousness is going up at the same time as, in a way, we're contracting into more and more of an individual contracted state. I'm not going to get into the complete counter-movement thing here tonight because it's just too involved, but I think you get the basic idea. So at the time that we become the most individual, the most separated, the difficulty of that is we lose perception of the spiritual world and we lose a sense of connection to everything that is. The benefit of it is that it sharpens our self-awareness. It sharpens our ability to think and to be conscious in a particular way that could only happen this way. So once that happens and we can begin to crystallize the I am self-awareness and we truly become self-aware, self-conscious, then two things can happen. Either we keep going down and we become more and more self-involved and become more materialistic, or we can begin to pull back up as that I am presence fully develops, and instead of just becoming a lower and lower beast-like form of being separate from everything, it instead becomes a transcendental consciousness where now with the fully awakened logical linear thinking and the ability to be self-aware, we can now fully awaken the I am inside of us and connect not just to ourselves, but start to expand back out to be transpersonal in our awareness. So that means that we identify ourselves with, to begin with, other people that are similar to us. And so we feel links to our family. And then we might feel links to our nation, and we're patriotic or whatever. And as we expand consciousness further, we might identify with larger and larger groups. But at the highest level of expanding our consciousness, we get to the point that we know that we're connected to everything that is. And that's what you find in Tibetan Buddhism. With the Bodhisattva vow, I will continue to incarnate to help all sentient beings until all sentient beings attain enlightenment. And that's the type of transpersonal Christ consciousness that we're talking about here. There's nothing separate in us from the sentient nature of all beings. It all comes from the unified Godhead. When that goes from being an intellectual construct to something that's as self-evident to us as anything else, we start to pull up here. Now that I am self-awareness can begin to transform our consciousness. So our detrimental thinking patterns, where we think very negatively, and we ascribe all types of angry and negative types of aspects to the people around us and to the things of the world around us, we can begin to transform that and illuminate it. Again, then we transform the life body and transform the physical body. Understanding that matrix makes sense of what's within the Rosicrucian process. Okay? So we're going to pause for a change of tape, and I'll take any questions people have while we're changing the tape. Was there a question a minute ago?
Yes.
Yeah.
You were saying that the spirit beings were interacting with us and influencing us in a dynamic way.
Their nature is when they interact with us. And again, this is only at the most general level. But one can identify then the more Ahrimanic influences because they really encourage us to feel very separate from other people. They encourage us to really believe only in materialistic science and in nothing of a spiritual nature. It's fine to lie, cheat, steal, get anything from anybody else because we're nothing but a biological accident anyway. Then in the most extreme form of the Luciferic, they lead us toward a variety of things, whether it can be in some ways a very self-aggrandizing type of spiritual development, where once you begin to get any type of spiritual understanding, you become the little guru, and like now you know everything, and you get your own group, and you do this whole trip. Or you can take it to a place where you just want to have ecstatic process all the time. And whether that becomes an ungrounded life that's just in spiritual process all the time, and your life is kind of in a shambles otherwise, or a person actually becomes addicted to drugs, alcohol, or something else. That's another manifestation of it. The desire for constant ecstatic process without doing hard work through the entire grounded method. So again, these different beings affect us in different ways. And we got that going again? Okay? Yes, you bet. So, back to our story already in progress. Now that we have a little bit of background, we can talk about a direct illustration of a Rosicrucian initiation school. Again, we have very little time tonight, so I just want to give you a general sense of this. Classically, as I mentioned, the Rosicrucian initiation system is based on individuals. They can work alone, they can work in small groups, whatever it is, but there's no central authority, there's no central institution. And so we tend not to have any real Rosicrucian initiation schools, etc. Again, there are different Rosicrucian organizations. They make varying levels of claim. But the classical impulse that you find with Rosicrucianism is very much that of what they call self-initiation. And the idea is that once you can awaken that I am inside through certain processes, then the task is to connect directly to spirit and not have to do it through connecting through another human being that'll then connect you to spirit. And this is not a new idea. I mean, the original Buddhists were all about this. You know, Buddha was all about the direct connection, and then after Buddha died, to be honest, in some parts of Buddhism, a priesthood came in that said, well, we'll pray to Buddha for you, kind of thing. and this is kind of an old story. But the general idea is, no, we want to connect directly. So Rudolf Steiner, a remarkable teacher living in Austria, who again, from my perspective, if you study his works, was really the most advanced Rosicrucian ever to teach publicly. That doesn't mean he was ever the most advanced Rosicrucian of all time, but he was the most advanced one that ever was like publicly out giving talks and doing these types of things. For those of you that know about the work of Rudolf Steiner, he lived from 1861 to 1925, and he left behind over 350 volumes of spiritual text. And there's material in those 350 volumes that you won't find anywhere else in print, having to do with initiation teachings of different traditions over time. Some really deep stuff, really remarkable. You have to get a little bit of a foundation under your belt sometimes to understand what he's talking about in the more advanced works, like anything else. But it's amazing what's there. So Steiner himself actually ran an initiation school within Rosicrucianism from 1904 to 1914, mostly in Germany and Switzerland. And the people that joined this school were meant to go through a particular path of development. But because it's so individual in its nature, Steiner would give different exercises to different people, depending on their structure and what they're developing toward. And so they actually had 4 different pathways you could enter in on when you began. The first pathway was called the general discipline, and it was somewhat similar to classical Hindu or Buddhist types of approaches. The general discipline that he had in his school was things like you would meditate at certain times of the day. You do various types of self-observation. You would go through a very grounded day-to-day process of spiritual work, spiritual study, things of that kind. The other 3 paths were a bit more specialized. The first one is a path that is mostly for people that are in the thinking pole, in the head. And that was called the Pythagorean, or the intellectual or art pathway. For those of you that have a background in sacred geometry or the Pythagorean work, the Pythagorean school was one that taught types of science and art based on classical spiritual teachings, mostly from Egypt. Pythagoras was actually trained in Egypt and in Babylon. I'm not going into all the details of that, but the basic idea is that if you look at the Pythagorean work, it's all related to sacred geometry, sacred number, various types of patterns in the world, and hidden within it are secrets of things like resonance and harmonics. Resonance is the process with which whatever energy quality we're holding at whatever level, whether it's within our energy body, emotional body, mental body, etc., whatever that energy quality is will resonate like a tuning fork with other beings, processes, planes of the same nature. And harmonics is where that resonance doesn't only take place on the physical plane, it can take place across multiple octaves, expressed scientifically, but spiritually it means that that resonance can be between something here on the physical world and something in higher spiritual worlds. And so resonance and harmonics is all through the Pythagorean work. So a person on this pathway they would definitely be studying things like sacred geometry. They'd be understanding the intellectual teachings. They'd be understanding the patterns of creation, and also working with them in art, directly expressing them, understanding them through doing to a certain extent. And so what this is meant to do is it illuminates the thinking. Again, not as just a type of intellectual activity, but to where the intellect develops to where it actually becomes clairvoyant. And so when we talk about something like sacred geometry forms, very commonly when we teach sacred geometry here at the Vesica Institute, the majority of the students that take the class will come to me later and say, you know, I've seen these patterns before. I've seen them in my meditations. I saw this one in my dream. Or I worked with a teacher in the Himalayas who gave me this pattern, or something like this. The patterns are related to direct thought forms of the mind of God that hold pattern the way we discussed before. The second of these was known as the Christian Gnostic or a devotional path. And this was really a heart-based path. It was a path of devotion. And we'll talk a little bit more later on when we talk about different levels of initiation or paths of initiation. But this is really a heart-based path. It's about devotional study and prayer of the heart, things of that kind. So we can develop various centers of the three primary centers, and it's really a question of which one we're crystallizing first. Or we can take what was known as the karma path or the action path, and that was a path of the will. That was people that really just want to go out and do it. They want to do something, and it's through the actual movement and the activity that they get initiated to a higher level. Something wakes up in them from the actual doing. And an example within the Rosicrucian work were people that worked in biodynamic agriculture. So they actually worked in the world. They're working with the forces of the earth and they're transmuting it to a higher level. They're bringing the life forces back into the earth through doing. And of course this is also related to recent studies that have been done of human development and how our actual moving of the body is essential for the development of our thinking process and the brain and things like that. So that essentially there are many fields now of educational kinesiology and related fields in which they describe the way that a child moves and acts in a certain way in the first few years, and it lays down all the neural pathways for later in life. And the actual physical movements have to be there. So anyway, they understood there were 4 different pathways that could be taken. Now, as you're moving through a process of initiation, this process could take on different forms at different stages. And so depending on what tradition you're looking at what time, they would have different names for the stages of development. You'd go from one stage to the next stage. So in classical initiation in the West, they would go often and use these types of terms for the stage of the person, sometimes in veiled form. There's a wonderful book that we have here on the back table called The Burning Bush by Edward Ray Smith. Edward Ray Smith was a Methodist minister who began to realize there was a lot within the esoteric tradition that explained the stuff that he had studied in his Bible studies. He was a Bible scholar, he could read the Greek, he could read the Hebrew, all that sort of thing. But he realized that a literal interpretation of a lot of this doesn't really work, that they're actually referring to something that when you study the esoteric tradition, it perfectly fits into place. So in The Burning Bush, it's a wonderful work where he summarizes a lot of the terms used in the Old and New Testament and what they actually meant within the initiation traditions for the Essenes, things like that. It's in a very grounded way. So the first stage of initiation in the classical initiation was called the raven. And so you see pictures of ravens in some types of alchemical manuscripts. And if you study the Old Testament, you'll see that the story of the initiation of Elijah, they say that Elijah was fed by a raven in the wilderness. And so for anyone that was part of the Kabbalistic initiation system, they knew what that meant. They knew that he is at the stage of the raven at that point. Because the raven is a dark bird and has to do with this dark element of the soul that is going to become illuminated through the process. The next stage is the occultist or the hidden scholar. And at that point, the person begins to actively study the spiritual realities behind the manifest world. At the next stage, they become known as the warrior. In the variant on this tradition that became the Christian Grail initiation in medieval times, this stage was called the knight. And the warrior stage was one in which one actually begins to work in the world for the goals and purposes one learns at these earlier stages. One becomes active working with it and applying it in the world. Next stage is that of the lion. There's some very interesting things in the early Holy Grail texts, like the book Parsifal, describing the nature of the lion. A lot of it has to do actually with the transformation of the heart and of the illumination of the heart. As I mentioned to you before, the Rosicrucians describe the way that when our heart is really illuminated and open, that releases the rose stream of light from the etherized blood that moves up to the third eye and then illuminates the cave of Brahma for higher clairvoyance. So we can develop forms of clairvoyance without the activity of the heart, but that form of clairvoyance can be very penetrating and cold. That's what black magicians develop. If we use the heart, though, we can move that clairvoyance to a much higher level. That's not just looking into people's weaknesses or how we can manipulate them, which can be done clairvoyantly, but actually looking into the soul nature of the person. What is the divine core of that person? Even if the person's acting out in a way that we can't stand them, we can try to look past that to see there's a divine core in this person, and we ask ourselves the Grail question of, brother or sister, what ails thee? You went through some type of suffering to be able to manifest yourself in this non-skillful way in the world that I find difficult to interact with. But it's based on suffering. That's why the Buddhists talk about, all life is suffering, everyone has suffered. The only way to get past anger and to forgive your enemies is to understand that your enemies suffer too. And so at this stage, the illumination of the heart really comes into play. There's other aspects as well. 5, at this stage, you would have in classical text where a person is called so-and-so the Greek, so-and-so the Persian, so-and-so the Samaritan. And what's hidden behind that is that at this stage, the person is actually becoming a representative of their people, of their tribe, of their group. And so they can actually represent what is good in the cultural impulse of that entire group of people. And those are the kind of people you always wanted to lead your group in ancient times. And so it always used to be that the person that was the oldest and the most spiritually illuminated led the country. Then it became a big political thing, but classical times, that was the ideal. Then the 6th stage was that of the sun hero. The sun hero you find in many ancient texts described, and this is the point where the person is literally connecting to the forces of the sun. Now again, in early Christianity, it was understood that the nature of the sun, S-U-N, and the sun, S-O-N, and the idea of the Christ is no different, because the physical sun up in the sky as a manifest body in our solar system has the same relationship to the ocean of fire that is the Godhead as seeing the Godhead as a quote-unquote father has to him having a child that is a son. In other words, the sun up in the sky is an emanation at a more macrocosmic level from the unified Godhead. And so at the level of the sun hero, we are moving our consciousness up to what we would think of as Christ consciousness, transpersonal consciousness, beyond our people, beyond ourselves, beyond our people, to actually taking in the whole of humanity, until finally it moves up to the stage called in the Western terms later, the Father, which is the foundation of all creation. What the Buddhists talk about, all sentient beings. I will continue to incarnate to aid all sentient beings until they attain enlightenment. So this is the way it was described classically as the stages one goes through. And we can see that within this is really a way of depicting a transformation of consciousness from one level to the next. Now there are 7 Rosicrucian stages of higher knowledge. So I want to contrast these a little bit. They're connected, but they're seen a little bit differently as things change over time. The first stage in the Rosicrucian way is the study of spiritual science. Now there's something hidden here. Why is the first stage the study of spiritual science? Now we're not talking about something clairvoyant here. We're talking about literally studying spiritual text. First part of it is to develop our capacity to think logically. Now in most spiritual circles today, in Western metaphysics, we look at things that are intellectual or logical as somehow lower than things that are spiritual. But that was not how it was understood in the original traditions. They understood the capacity to think logically as a superpower that would allow you to completely transform nature and to use all the forces of nature. And that's what it's done. We're harnessing the forces of nature more and more through the capacity to think logically. Also, the capacity to think logically allows us to become self-aware to a deeper level and to guide our own lives. If you can't think logically, how can you act without a guru? You'd have to have a guru to tell you what to do, like when you're 1 year old and you need a parent to show you what direction to go. You have to be able to think logically and evaluate. So the study of spiritual science is connected to this. To actually get a framework, you have to have a context to understand things. If you don't have a context, you can't possibly evaluate what's going to be my best option to do in this situation. You have to know what your choices are and the whole context they fit in. But there's something else hidden behind it. And what's hidden behind it at the deeper level, when you take off one of the veils, is that the study of spiritual science allows you to put into your mind an understanding of a particular structure. Any pattern is related to sacred geometry. That pattern is related to the mind of God. So, as a practical matter, when you study spiritual science, you understand different levels of consciousness, different spiritual planes, different human subtle bodies, the evolution over great periods of time. Those actually put a structure in your consciousness that allow higher spiritual beings to tell you more. It's like if you had to run up on somebody and you're trained in physics and they're not, and you're going to tell them something that they can do that would really help people. You're going to have a hard time trying to find the words about, okay, now you got to do this and that, if they don't know the concepts. It's the same thing here. Higher spiritual beings can give us information about what we need to do with our lives to help other people, all kinds of great processes, if we have the core concepts to begin with that they can work with. Otherwise, it's really hard to communicate with us in a way that moves up to their level. So the study of spiritual science is to actually lay down contextual foundations in our thinking, in our mind, that these spiritual beings can then come in, and when we're meditating or we're relaxed, all of a sudden things start to click internally. We get these downloads that happen in a second. We begin to see how all these things fit together. But we can't have it without having the things planted in place first, without having the context first. So it's not just an intellectual thing, it lays the foundation for the spiritual beings to come and show us how it all fits together and how we can apply it. Second stage is called acquiring imaginative knowledge. This is referred to as imagination with a capital I by the Rosicrucians. At this stage, we begin to develop a clairvoyant perception that's related to the faculty of sight. So we can actually perceive things in the non-physical world in a way that is spiritually similar to in the physical world. If you say somebody is visual or auditory or kinesthetic, so one person primarily processes information through the eyes, they're visual, through the ears, they're auditory, through feeling, they're kinesthetic. The exact same thing is true spiritually. Some people will process the clairvoyance primarily through a type of internal sight, and they see all these images on their mental screen. A lot of those images are not actually present in the spiritual world, but they're how they clothe non-physical realities so they can access it and they can work with it. And so that's the imagination stage. We can now see non-physical realities in the mind's eye. We can't see with the physical eyes that there's an angelic being in front of us, but in the mind's eye we can begin to perceive that form. We might clothe it in different ways. If I'm a Tibetan, I might see it as a blue-skinned being above the floor with its radiance of light, etc. And if I'm a Christian, Jew, Muslim, I might see it as a great being of light with these huge wings, and maybe if it's a higher hierarchy, instead of 2 wings, it has 6 wings like the seraphim, or whatever it might be. But it's a way to represent seeing these non-physical forces. The next stage is reading the occult script. And without going into the depths of this, we can say that this is another type of clairvoyant perception that the Rosicrucians call inspiration with a capital I. This is a type of spiritual hearing. This is what is classically called basically hearing the tones of the universe, hearing these great cosmic symphonies around us all the time, hearing the symphony of the spheres. And so with this, we are able to understand higher realities through tones. So people that are musicians or really like music, you know that if you watch a movie, depending on the soundtrack, the exact same scene is a tragedy or a comedy. Depending on the sound, it tells you what the emotional content is. And the same thing is true here. Rather than seeing a visual image of a being, one would hear a tone coming from the being, and the tone would give you a quality of the being's internal nature. Everything tones and resounds musically in a great harmony. And we also, of course, do this all the time in our daily life when you hear somebody's voice. People's voices have a tone. That tone carries a part of their intrinsic spiritual nature. And then what was called living into the spiritual environment. And this is also known by the Rosicrucians as intuition with a capital I. This intuition is the ability to actually feel and interact with higher spiritual realities through how things feel internally. And so it's like a kinesthetic person. They have to feel something, they have to touch it. Now, this stage is something that actually allows us, you see that this is actually at a deeper stage than the imagination stage, seeing the image. Because as we go into higher and higher planes, we're going to have some of these levels drop away. And so to give you an example of that, as we go to what we call the astral plane is basically a realm of images. You see then with color and light. A higher plane past that, we primarily don't see things, but we hear the tones. At a higher plane closer to the Godhead beyond that, then we primarily can experience it through intuition. And with that, we actually feel the nature of the beings, the planes, etc., that we're connecting to. You have it as an internal knowledge inside of you. It's no longer outside, it's inside. Like they say in the Indian tradition, that art thou, you are that. You know internally the exact nature of the thing that you're connecting with. That is also connected with the idea that in higher realities, in the physical world, physical bodies are always separate. We can never fully interpenetrate. But in higher spiritual planes, that's not true. You can access what appears to be a spiritual being on a higher plane that appears to be one being. And then it begins to peel out, one being after another, out of the composite being. Because these beings can actually move into one composite being at a higher level. It's not like the physical plane. There's no physical separation. If they are of the same resonant quality, they can become one composite being. An idea sometimes called combinescence. Then the next stage is knowledge of the relations between the macrocosm and the microcosm. Now we understand the way that the higher spiritual world and the physical world fit together. It's a continuum. They're not really separate. The astral world is not something out there. The astral world is all around and inside of us all the time. We begin to understand the way macrocosm and microcosm fit together. And then the next stage, we actually have a union with the macrocosm. We can connect to the higher macrocosmic forces. And this is related to higher stages of alchemy, some of the teachings you find in Taoist yoga, a lot of different traditions, when there's actually a union with the macrocosmic forces. And then the final stage is given different terminology in different texts. In one, they would refer to it as attaining blissfulness in God. Another would call it unifying the earlier stages. But essentially at this point of being able to unify with the macrocosm, there is not a separation of oneself from the Godhead. One can completely unify with the nature of the Godhead that's inside of our I Am presence. And this happens as a totality after the transformation of the other lower bodies. So this is the general sense of the 7 Rosicrucian stages. So that then leads to the question of, okay, from this really big picture of how things fit together, what does one actually do as a system of initiation practices? And you can find all types of Rosicrucian work where there are different types of practical applications of the work that they do. It might be hands-on healing. It might be working with the forces in the earth like biodynamics. It might be all kinds of things that are practical applications. But the practical applications all come from a certain type of internal development. And in fact, it's understood in Rosicrucianism and by the Sufis and by other groups that to train in such a way as to try to develop particular types of esoteric spiritual skills or abilities, if you have not developed the foundational transformation of consciousness, is something that's actually not helpful over time. It actually takes you in a very different path if you try to develop the skills rather than having transformed your consciousness to when those new occult powers come up naturally. They'll just develop on their own. So you can find teachers in the Himalayas, the Sufis, etc. They all teach this principle. Don't train for the power, train for the state of consciousness, and then the power will present itself naturally. Depending on the group, there can be different types of prohibitions on the use of powers publicly. The Rosicrucians have a particular prohibition about the use of one's powers to help oneself rather than to help others. It's really done to be put at the service of others. And in some traditions, they don't allow you to make any public demonstration of one's spiritual or occult abilities at all, particularly among classical Sufi groups. They got a very solid prohibition about never do a miracle in public, because that's going to get you the exact type of attention that you don't want. It'll attract the kind of people that are not the people you should be training, the people that are attracted to power, who are attracted to surfaces, not the people that are ready to do the core transformation work. And at another time, there are many wonderful stories about these Sufi saints who can do incredible things but again, always did their best not to demonstrate it publicly. So, initiation practices. The core of it has to be the awakened self, of attaining directly, from the Christian perspective, directly with the Christ being, which would be essentially the same as in other traditions of connecting to the mind of God, because the Christ being is a macrocosmic being that represents this for us and that directly interacts with us all the time. So one of the most fundamental practices for the Rosicrucians are what they call the 6 basic exercises. Now the 6 basic exercises were talked about by Rudolf Steiner as something that if you did nothing else, do these, because some types of occult practices that you do could actually end up being harmful to you. But any of those harmful effects could actually be neutralized if you practice the 6 basic exercises. A little bit of background to this. Why are there 6 basic exercises? If you went into the larger context of it, there's the understanding that the different energy centers in the human body have a geometry to them. And so the Hindus teach that the heart center is a 12-petal lotus. In other words, there's a 12-fold differentiation of functions inside the heart center. And so within Rosicrucianism, there are these kind of veiled references to within those 12 centers of the heart. In our previous stages of evolution, we've already developed 6 of them. The other 6 we need to develop now. So every one of these 6 exercises actually develops one of the petals on the heart chakra and helps bring the heart into full activity. That's kind of a hidden layer of this. But in general terms, the 6 basic exercises, the first 3 parts of them are again working with the basic idea that we have 3 basic soul faculties. That's the same thing as saying that our astral body has 3 different aspects: the thinking, the feeling, and the willing. Thought, speech, and action for the Buddhist, head, heart, and hands for the Sufis, upper and middle, lower Dantian for the Chinese Taoists, etc. We have these 3 primary centers: thinking, feeling, and willing. So the first thing we have to do is like what Gurdjieff talked about. We have to begin to self-observe. We have to observe ourselves through the course of the day. We have to observe, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I doing? That act in itself, something always also described by the Buddhist in great detail, will actually begin to use the light of our consciousness to illuminate the thinking process, to illuminate our feeling process and our willing process. What this allows us to do is we can then begin to see how much of what we go through every day internally is completely unconscious. It's just one reactive state after another. You get a particular external trigger and you have a particular reaction to it. And so this is the foundation. If you did this, you would end up reaching the goal if you did nothing else. If you don't do this, nothing else you do will matter. You have to do the self-observation, and once you can illuminate, let's say, your thinking process, then, because you can now recognize that moment at which you start to go unconscious. There are these great descriptions of the work of Gurdjieff, particularly from his pupil, P.D. Ouspensky, where Ouspensky has learned from Gurdjieff the process of self-remembering. And he's walking through the streets of St. Petersburg in Russia, and he's so proud of himself because now I can self-remember. What that means is I'm actually aware of myself at this moment. I'm aware of myself walking, I'm aware of myself talking, I'm aware of what I'm thinking and I'm feeling. And he's walking along and everything's great. And then he looks in a shop window and he sees something. And he says, and then I woke up 8 hours later at home. And we often have that experience. You know, we go out to do something, and all of a sudden we wake up and it's hours later, and I went to work, I went to the store and I bought groceries, I did this other thing, and I realized I've been completely unconscious the whole time. I'm just now becoming self-aware again. Sometimes if you look back on your childhood, there are whole parts of your childhood that most of us can't even remember. But there are parts you do remember. Those are the moments in which you were self-aware. That's why you remember them easily now, compared to those that you don't. So, Ouspensky then began to realize this entire process to where we're rarely completely conscious, and it's hard to stay self-aware. And he began to be aware of that threshold between being fully conscious and going to sleep. And that's absolutely critical. So that in our thinking process, it's like I've got my good spiritual persona on, and I'm open-hearted, and I'm dealing with everybody in a beneficial way, and good for me. And then something happens and somebody speaks to me in a way that triggers some emotional response. And then I literally go unconscious and I just respond to them reactively. And the goal is to start seeing that particular boundary point where I go unconscious and catching myself before I pass out. I stay conscious, I stay thinking, and I stay rational. And it's much harder to do than it sounds. And it's that much harder to do with the feeling and the willing, because those are already less conscious than our thinking is. But when we begin to see how much negative feeling we actually harbor about other people and all the things in the world, it's not a pretty picture. And then to see what we actually are doing in the world, this is a thing not only of what we are actually doing, we might do some things that when we begin to review it in a later exercise, we say, ooh, what I did with my will forces, what I actually did as an action with that person, it actually harmed them. I was almost fully unconscious at the time. Hey, it wasn't me, I wasn't even aware at the time. But nonetheless, it harmed them, the action that I took. But it's also sins of omission. So there are things that I could have done to help somebody. It would have taken me 60 seconds. I could have been somehow more conscious. I could have said something to them. I could have offered something to them. It would have helped them. And I missed it. And so it's a matter of really observing and illuminating these different aspects of ourselves and then stabilizing them. For the Rosicrucian teacher, people like Steiner, the first thing they look at is, are these things stable in a person? If a person does not have stable thinking, feeling, and willing, no higher development is possible. These things are the absolute foundation. Now, this doesn't mean that there's not a lot of more advanced work to do, but without this, there's no foundation to the building. The building will collapse. Then, of course, we have to start working on soul qualities to orient this the right way. So the next thing is to work on positivity. And Steiner used to like to give this illustration about a Persian legend of the Christ, where the Christ is walking down the road, and he and the disciples pass a dead dog, and the dog has been dead for days. There are maggots crawling in the dog, there are flies in his eyes, it's really grotesque. All the disciples like, ooh, and turn away, except for the Christ, who just keeps looking and walks by. And then after they pass it, he smiles and turns to the disciples, and in this Persian legend, he says, what beautiful teeth that animal had. You know, he's looking for the positivity in that. And so to always look for the positive, to keep that energy up, because what you'll find is that, you know, we all know that positivity is important, but you'll actually find that it changes the vibrational quality of the subtle bodies in a way that changes your resonance with other beings. That has to be present to resonate with the beings that we're aiming for here. And openness. Openness is also sometimes referred to by the Rosicrucians as equanimity. And so this is being open to new information, new ways of seeing things. The Rosicrucians are really strong about not getting stuck in one way of seeing things. So everything that Rosicrucians teach is not dogmatic. Because if it's dogmatic, it's one perspective, and this is the only true perspective, and it's not seen that way here. The openness is to be able to see things from multiple perspectives, and the more perspectives you have, the closer you get to its reality. Like the blind men and the elephant. You're stuck with a spear and a pillar and whatever else until you see all the different perspectives and you know, hey, it's an elephant. By the same token here, this has to do with the particular soul capacity that Steiner refers to as being able to walk a circle around anything in our lives, around any subject. And in walking the circle, we need to see it from 12 different perspectives. And in a way, that's what the world religions are. They're walking a circle around a central reality and seeing it from different perspectives. Not one is right and one is wrong. It's walking the circle and seeing from an opposite perspective of yours, and you see more of the totality of what's held in the center. Now, it was also called equanimity because it has to do with not having emotional reaction to other ideas or things that come up. And so there's a certain stability that comes with this. We're open to things, but we also have a very stable internal soul life. We don't fall into reactivity. Because for anyone here that's done emotional process work, which is probably the majority of people here, you know that the reactive mind and reactivity is a thing that constantly brings us down. And the last part is simply to harmonize all this together, the harmony of all aspects. Because when you're not used to doing this, you got to focus on one thing at a time. Okay, today I'm focusing on observing my thinking. Today I'm observing my feeling, etc. But once it's become second nature, all of this needs to flow into a complete totality that you don't even think about. This is the foundation in the background for doing the deeper work. So that's the 6 basic exercises. I just want to give you an idea of a few other of these practices as we come to an end here. Another practice was called the backward review. The backward review is very important to do at the end of every day. In Steiner's own initiation school, he made it a basic practice for everybody. What the backward review is, if you work with German Rosicrucians, they'll always use the term Rückschau. Rückschau just means backward review, basically, or to look backwards. Is that at the end of your day, as you're about to go to bed, the meditation to do is to intensively from that moment when you're about to go to bed, go backward through your day in reverse order. Now I'm at the moment just before I went to bed. Now I'm at the point where I went to the bathroom. Now I'm at the point where I watched TV. Now I'm at the point that I had dinner. Now I'm at the point that I'm driving home from work, etc. You go back through the day, all the way back to the point when you were last asleep. It might have been a nap. It might have been early that morning. And there's very deep spiritual processes behind this that we're not going to get into all the details of now, but it relates to some very important energetic processes in a human being. But by going backward through that day until the last time that you woke up, what you're actually doing is you're becoming conscious of the activities of that day. So it's a part of this whole waking up process. There are all kinds of things laid inside of it. So one of the things is that by going backward, thinking backwards, we're actually developing a new strength, like we're flexing a muscle within our etheric life body. The etheric life body is our body of memory. And the etheric body holds all of our life forces. When we begin to exercise the capacity to think backwards instead of forwards the way we normally do, we're actually exercising something in the life body of memory that will become a force that can be used for higher initiation and alchemical purposes later on. But we'll stick with this for the moment. So moving backward and looking at that, we're developing this new force. But another thing that it can do is it can allow us to observe things that happen during the course of the day that we did not expect. So a corollary to this is that when we wake up from the nap or we wake up in the morning, we spend a moment before we get up in what we think is going to happen. Okay, I think I'm going to work, I'm going to meet so-and-so, blah, 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 blah. And I got a sense of general plan of the day. Now then, when you, at the end of the day, look backwards, you sometimes find that very different things happen than you had planned, or that things that were completely unexpected somehow inserted themselves. And what develops over time with this observation process is you begin to become aware of the spiritual beings and forces that came in at that time to bring something unexpected, something you didn't plan. And this is a very important adjunct to what's being taught in some metaphysical circles today about, create your day and you control everything in your life. It really has got to be in a balanced format where there's a certain amount of what you create and a certain matter of openness for what Spirit can bring to us. So we don't try to rigidly control, no, I'm going to control every minute of my day. The spiritual forces are going to bring things in that we don't expect. And if we look back on our life history, if we did this back review for our entire lives, and we would find some of the most important things that happened with us, where we went to certain places, or we learned certain things, or we met a certain person that ended up changing our whole life, or we got married to, or whatever it was. These are things we never expected. We couldn't have planned. Something else brought us to that resonant point of intersection. We're not getting into it tonight, but a part of this also then links to the classical concept of receiving the conversation of the holy guardian angel. Guardian angel is the spiritual being that's the closest to us, and through this practice we begin to become more conscious of its activity with us every day. I could go on, but you get the idea of the backward review. Next we have the observation of life forces, of growth and decay. Today we have this fantastic tool where we can use film equipment to literally see these Walt Disney films of a seed sprouting and then becoming a plant and blossoming and fruiting and withering away. And we can see in a moment what the Rosicrucians classically did through a process of observation that would take an entire year. They would watch every part of a growth process. For any of you that have children, you've done the exact same thing with your child. You saw every stage of the growth process of that child and how these forces then naturally unfolded in a particular way. Now the observation of the life forces does something very significant, very important, and that is that it develops a particular type of clairvoyant faculty inside of us to see how things move through life processes from one stage to another. Because if we can begin to see that, first we observe it in the natural world, then we develop this as an internal capacity to do everything from understanding human spiritual evolution over time, to, if we encounter a particular person, to see where they are on a process of crystallizing their I am self-awareness. Now this then leads to the concept of when we encounter any person in Rosicrucianism, the goal is to, when you encounter them, to see their archetype, to see their ideal self, their spiritual core, and where that spiritual core is going. We're all different. We're all like snowflakes. We're all made of frozen water in a sense, but we all have a different geometry. Significance of that is that we're developing different skill sets that when, as a new spiritual hierarchy ourselves, as a new angelic rank ourselves, we're just at the adolescent stage now, where we're like 21 and running around, we don't know what we're doing, but we're semi-mature if we chose to act that way. We're in that stage of development where, as we move further down our lives, we'll end up developing certain sets of skills, understandings, knowledge. And so this is linked to the whole concept that over time, the things that cause us the most pain in life sometimes become the source of our greatest strengths. And so what we then begin to perceive in people is that there's been a trajectory of who they've been before and who they are now and who they're going to become. And this is what in Catholicism is called teleological destination, that we're moving toward a particular destination with ourselves, that there's a certain aspect of it that's universal for all human beings, the attainment of enlightenment, but it's going to be that we're going to crystallize in slightly different forms to do different things. And so this is a real divine mystery. Every human being holds this divine mystery, and to see what's held within it. It also leads us to actually perceive the hidden spirit and spiritual beings working through all the forces of nature. So, give you some idea of the observation of life forces and growth and decay. Then, of course, the study of spiritual science we talked about before is fundamental because we have to put down those concepts that allow us to logically understand how things fit together. Now, as we're studying things, we have a particular practice that we do. It's called the dissolving practice. The dissolving practice is an alchemical way to read spiritual text, so that if you're reading a text from any spiritual tradition, what you're actually reading as words on the page was the attempt of someone to crystallize into written language a direct spiritual experience that they had. The only way to get to the core of what they're trying to tell you without getting caught up in a fundamentalist literalist trap is to actually regain the experience they had they're trying to communicate through the words. That means the words have to be dissolved into a direct inner spiritual experience. And so it's a type of meditative reading. And this is very important. And it's part of a whole alchemical process that we go through in consciousness. So once we can dissolve the spiritual text into the original experience, it opens up a great world for us and is absolutely vital for going to deeper parts of spiritual teachings that have been preserved. Now this is also connected to the next stage, which is something called the Michaelic Yoga. And we're going to wind up here in just a second, but I think it's worth taking time to try to flesh out what is it that the Rosicrucians call Michaelic Yoga. What would be a yoga that you would do with the Archangel Michael? Who is the Archangel Michael? We mentioned before that the name Archangel Michael means who is as God. It is the being at the level of the archangelic hierarchy, which is a spiritual group of beings 2 stages above the human race at the current point. Humans, angels, archangels, archai, etc. The way we described in the classical Kabbalistic and Western teachings. All the Western tradition follows that particular model. That the Archangel Michael is the highest of the archangels. He has the same qualities as the Godhead for functioning at the archangelic level. And Archangel Michael is also known as the regent of the cosmic intelligence. That means the way that the Godhead sees the big picture for how things fit together, Archangel Michael has that capacity at the archangelic level. He sees how things fit together. If you go into the deeper waters of this, you find these medieval texts about the 7 archangels that guide different periods of time. The 7 different archangels because they have a rulership of about 300 years each during each part of the Platonic cycle, where we move through the constellations. Each constellation we move through in the precession of the equinox takes 2,160 years. I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but let's just say that Michael is one of these archangels that helps to guide time. And he's the one that has the picture of how it all fits together. So this Michaelic Yoga is a type of internal exercise that's related to the consciousness of Archangel Michael. Steiner describes it as talking about the way that initiation has changed over time. In earlier times, we would have a guru give us particular types of exercises, and they would guide and observe every part of our activity, because we couldn't make choices for ourselves. We don't have enough context. We don't know enough. We don't see enough. But now we're at the point that we're doing this for ourselves. So with this particular process, what we have is that in the ancient schools, they taught a particular type of breathing. And the way they breathed at that time was to actually make themselves more conscious by being conscious of the breath in and out. So there's a particular yoga of the inhale of the breath and of the exhale of the breath. And what Steiner is basically saying with the Michaelic Yoga is that for the Rosicrucian, we have the same inhale and exhale, but now it's done in pure consciousness. It's not done with the breath per se. So when we inhale, in a sense, the observation of the physical world, then that's what we would call a perception. I perceive something in the physical world. Whatever I see, if I'm observing nature or a human being, whatever it is, I'm breathing in that perception. And that's a completely receptive activity. If I don't have a receptive soul, I can't do it. But we breathe that in, and we hold the perception inside of us. It might be the movement of a child. It might be the growth of a flower. It might be whatever it is. And then we breathe out the concept. A concept is where now I can see inside what I have perceived, the spirit inside of it. So when we say that, I have a concept about this or that, we tend to deal with the idea of a concept as something very intellectual and abstract. Oh, that's all just a bunch of concepts. But a true concept is a thought form from the mind of God. A true concept is a direct perception of spirit within matter. And that's why it's called a concept. The term conception means birth. And a concept is a birth inside of the human mind of the direct perception of spirit working in the world. And so instead of breathing in and breathing out, we're breathing in the perception of the world receptively, and then we're actively breathing out the concept, where now I have perceived the spirit in the world. This is extremely significant. So what I want to connect this with then is when we talked about this particular process where we made this movement of manifestation, there was this descent from the spiritual world. Clairvoyant became then a loss of clairvoyance, became more and more individual with our awareness, and pulled back up. There's a process here where all of creation goes through cycles of crystallization and dissolving. That's what alchemy is all about. Solva et coagula. It dissolves and it crystallizes. And so with this crystallization process, in time, it will dissolve again. Everything that has moved from spirit here into the physical world has the spirit within it, but in a sense it's trapped in matter. And many different traditions talk about this. And it's important for human beings because every being in the world has a function. If you study all the biological beings of the world, the worms, the animals, whatever it might be, they all perform a function in the world. They all have a quality in the world. And the human being is, in a sense, the crown of creation. We're the ones that have the fullest, most awakened microcosm of the macrocosm. But that's not a privilege, that's a responsibility. Because everything is consciousness, and everything comes from the consciousness of the mind of God. What this means is that when we can develop the mind of God inside of us, because it's now moved through the process of crystallizing into matter, our being able to do the Michaelic Yoga, to breathe in the percept of the physicality and breathe out the concept of now seeing and recognizing the spirit within the matter, this actually performs the function that the Godhead performed of moving it from here to here. The activity of the human race moves it from here back to here. It's our activity of consciousness in perceiving the spirit in matter that links the mental concept that we have back to the mind of God and brings the ascent wave back up. Now, this is something I just want to say one other quick thing about, because we talk a lot today about ascension, and ascension is absolutely fundamental in spiritual development. But within Rosicrucianism, they have a very clear difference between what they call Luciferic ascension and Christic ascension, or it could also be called Michaelic ascension. And without spending much time on it, the upshot of it is that Luciferic ascension is basically the idea that I don't like to be here, and I'm going to get out of here as quickly as possible. And I'm going to basically deny the things of the world. I'm not going to continue to work with all the processes of the world or try to work in the normal processes of society, etc. And I'm just going to work on myself, and I'm going to try to separate and get out of here as quickly as possible. That's different from the Christic form of ascension, which is actually to go as deeply as possible into the experiences of the physical world, because by doing so we develop strengths that we can't develop if we pull out too quickly. It's like if I tried to get a caterpillar that's in the cocoon and cut it out, I'm just going to have a mess. I'm not going to have a butterfly. There's a whole thing about going into the cocoon of the physical world and the experiences we have here that shape us. They are the alchemical experiences that we're meant to have here, the stuff we don't like going through. They actually shape us in a particular way. And so this Christic ascension is like the model scene with the life of Christ, that the Christ went through this entire process all the way to crucifixion, and then the descent into hell, and then the resurrection, etc., as this model, this passion play of going all the way down to complete union with the earth, and then coming back. And at that point, basically said, I will be with you always until the end of days. And that is mirrored in other traditions like the Buddhists, where the Buddhists once again say things in the Bodhisattva vow, like, I will continue to incarnate until all sentient beings attain enlightenment. It's the exact same spiritual impulse. And so for us, it's the thing of grasping the nature of the physical world and working with it deeply and helping every being in the physical world and pulling it up on the pathway of ascension instead of saying, well, I'm out of here, good luck, and here I go. So this is the big overview of the general idea of a system of initiation within Rosicrucianism. And within this time, I've tried to give you a sense of the bigger context as well as some of the actual practical exercises. And we are doing a workshop next weekend that is on this topic, working with the exercises and going into more detail on the context. And I'll open it up to any questions people have.
Would you please define concept again?
A concept, in the larger sense of it, is actually an ability for the mind to see a spiritual reality. It's the same thing as what in the Greek school, with the Platonists and the Pythagoreans, when they talked about seeing an ideal type or seeing an idea, they understood that that was actually a direct perception either of spirit and matter or a direct perception of the mind of God at this very high spiritual archetypal level that every tradition talks about, but they call it different things, in which the pattern of everything is given in the mind of God. And so that's what we're actually doing. When we can think with true spiritual concepts, that becomes what the Rosicrucians call sense-free thinking, and it's also linked to a deeper aspect that we haven't gone into tonight of the new clairvoyance that the Rosicrucians talk about. And again, that connects it back up because living thinking, true living thinking instead of dead thinking, living thinking connects us through that process with the mind of God itself, because it's all the same substance.
So, for example, as I would perceive somebody doing acts maybe that I didn't like.
Yes.
However, I saw their soul.
Yes.
And then that would be doing that act. Right?
Yes, it's directly connected to that Rosicrucian practice we mentioned, that when you see a person, you look for what inside of them is their spiritual core and their spiritual destination. What will this person become over great periods of time if their alchemical development continues on the right path? They're going to be something very, very special and unique. And to see the uniqueness of that, and also, again, as a way to deal with the less pleasant aspects they might be manifesting, to look at what type of suffering have they had, how do they suffer that has led them to act out in this way? Or how are they blinded or stuck in this purely reactive mind processes that keep them acting in this way? Was there, yes please?
A Sufi teacher that I work with says that path that
Luciferic path?
path,
Huh?
he said he felt at least that path is closed. I don't know if I'm in his lifetime, because he knows he's been a monk in many lifetimes, and he said in this time, he said that it's not as there like it used to be. He said, I know because I've knocked on that door now. And I just wondered if you agree with that.
My perspective,
There's still monks in there, whatever, but he feels like it's not as open as it was.
I think he might be speaking about it in terms of a monastic path that is a type of path of isolation from the world and this type of thing.
It's not as open as it was.
I think that's probably true. I think that that monastic path is not quite as open as it used to be. It is still something, though, that is open and can be done for particular alchemical periods of time to create a sealed retort that one works within that's very closely contained, where all the forces are held in. Spending an entire lifetime in it, that would be a larger question if that would be really beneficial for a person or not. I wouldn't pass a final judgment on it. I would separate that concept, though, of the monastic path as a life path as being different from the Luciferic pathway. The Luciferic pathway is always open because any person that chooses to follow a life that is not well-grounded, or a spirituality that is kind of airy-fairy, not well-grounded, and doesn't really lead to something for them or somebody else, that's a Luciferic pathway. Yes, please.
Do you think an astrology natal chart can say what kind of initiate we are, or indicate what kind of initiate we are primarily, and what stage that our soul is in this incarnation?
To a particular degree. The natal chart, what people that are really good with astrology or Vedic palmistry or whatever method of reading these things are, they use the basic blueprint as a structure of the soul. But then they need to look into the individual to see how far they are along the path. Because a whole bunch of people might have been born at that exact same time, but they're actually on different levels in the path, despite being born at the same moment. But one thing that you get from a natal chart is that there's a kind of imprinting of the geometry of the heavens at the time of incarnation. It's all pure geometry. If you look at a natal chart, it's all an angular relationship of this body, which has a vibrational quality, to this body, which has a vibrational quality. When those two vibrational qualities are directly opposite, it's different than if they're at 45 degrees, etc. It's a real study of sacred geometry and cosmic influences on a human being. So it relates to the person's structure in all kinds of very deep ways. You would still need to use a kind of a vertical approach to get a sense of how far they along their particular pathway within that structure, because that could vary from one person to another who's born at that time. But one very important aspect of this is that we need to be aware that everybody's subtle body structures are a little bit different. So that we have certain structures in the subtle body that are universal. You know, we talk about the chakras, acupuncture meridians, etc. These are universal. But within that, there are other structures within the subtle bodies, within the life body, within the consciousness body, that are very different from person to person. Because every thought that you have, every feeling you have, every action you take actually sculpts the subtle bodies. That's how you become the person you become. And so one of the skills developed over time in this type of work or in sacred geometry work is to begin to recognize the different structures inside of people. And so for people that work as initiation teachers in different traditions, one of the major things that they do is they actually examine a person's structure, their psychological structure and their literal subtle body structures. They see what's been built there. And that'll tell them the current stage of the person's development and also what they need to do next. And in many cases, if the person who's doing the initiation work is very conscious as a teacher, they'll know that in many cases the person cannot do the same type of work the teacher does, because the teacher has crystallized themselves in a particular way, and this person doesn't have the structure for it. They have to actually do it a different way. I enjoyed it one time when I worked at the Clairvision School in Australia, French medical doctor Samuel Sagan. That person asked him a question once of, how do you do this particular type of clairvoyant activity? And Sagan thought for a moment, and then he replied, you really shouldn't ask me how I do it, because you can't do it the way that I do it. I developed my capacity to do it a very long time ago, and you can't develop it the same way now. You need to ask me how you can develop it. And so once we can see what people's structures are, that can be very important. My last thing here, and then I'm going to have to wind up for the night, is that this also becomes something when we do any type of meditative practice from any tradition, because most of us are on an independent spiritual path where we are self-initiating. We might train with different people, etc. Most of us don't have one guru that tells us everything to do. Because of that, we learn a lot of different practices, a lot of different meditations, and we have to choose which ones am I going to do with my limited amount of time and energy on a regular basis, because those are going to change our destiny, choosing which ones to do. So at the end of the practices that we do here, I always have people check in for a moment before they come out of the practice. And I say, ask yourself the silent question, how has this practice structured my consciousness and my body of energy? And you need to check in anytime you do any practice and see what structures it's creating in you. You can actually feel something energetically beginning to form inside of yourself, or you can feel your consciousness taking on a particular perspective by these things. And for one person, that particular set of practices might be great. For another, it might not be the most effective way for them to get to the goal that they're going toward. Okay, thank you all very much. We're going to have to wind it up here. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
We also have a minor announcement.
What's that?
This is Saturday evening, and the front doors and the garage doors, as well as the garage gate locks. So if anybody's in the garage, I have a key, because we have to let you out. If you don't front doors, you cannot look back in because the door opens.
Okay? So if you're parked in the garage, he'll let you in and out.
Find me and open it.
Thank you. You too. Yeah.
I wanted to tell you, with your list of the 7 stages, the occult scholar, the warrior, and the lion, it's just like Wizard of Oz. The scarecrow, the